Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. We are currently reading Manitou Blood by Graham Masterton, and this week we're beginning with Chapter 20. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy the story. Chapter 20, Bloodstream. Monster Slayer's appearance had trashed Amelia and Bertie's apartment so comprehensively that we helped them to move to the colonial-style apartment upstairs, whose owners were on vacation on the Turks and Caicos Islands. I was trying to convince myself that Monster Slayer and his clan would succeed in hunting down the Strigoi, but I still didn't think it was safe for Amelia and Bertie to stay in a place with no glass in the windows. Before we left, Gil and I went around their temporary new accommodation, room by room, and smashed every single mirror. Amelia said, "Nigel's really going to love us when he sees this." "Hey," I reassured her, "Nigel won't care about his front door or his mirrors. He'll just be happy that you've managed to survive." "Do you want something to eat?" asked Bertie. "Of course, we can't give you any hot food, but we have some cans of soup and some Swedish rye bread." "That's all right," I told him. "We'd better be getting back to Jenica. I don't like leaving her too long on her own." Amelia came up to me and held both of my hands. "Another strange adventure," she said. "Why do these things always happen to us, Harry?" "We're mystics. It's our job. Who else is going to do it if we don't?" "Do you think this will work, calling up Monster Slayer?" "I don't know. I hope so. But I still have to find Miss Comacus and fix him." "You'll come back to see me, won't you? I don't want you to disappear and never find out what's happened to you." I could see Bertie looking fidgety, so I kissed her on the forehead and said, "You know me, Erskine the Indestructible. Come on, Gil, we'd better get out of here." Gil left me on the corner of Leroy Street so that he could go back to his apartment and check up on his wife and daughter. The city was still silent as I walked back, but just as I climbed the steps of the Dragomir's house, I was convinced that I heard a man screaming. I stopped and listened, but it wasn't repeated. I went inside and made sure that the door was locked behind me. Upstairs, Jenica was lying on the couch asleep. One of her father's diaries was lying open on the carpet beside her. I shook her shoulder, and she opened her eyes and stared at me as if she didn't recognize me. "Oh, I was having such a strange dream." "Nothing could be stranger than what we just did." Jenica sat up and stretched her back. "How did it go? Did your seance work?" "Work? We raised up the meanest vampire-hunting SOB you can possibly imagine. Monster Slayer. Like, yes, he was made up of smoke and dust, that's all. But you should have seen him. He has these horns like a demon, and this dazzling light that comes out of his eyes. It's like a death ray. Zap! And then bam! And there's a huge great hole in the wall. You should have been there, Jenica. I mean it. Changing Woman appeared, and she was 4 different women, only the same woman at 4 different ages. Then Changing Woman called up Monster Slayer. Amelia's whole apartment was totaled. I mean, it was wrecked, but the whole thing was unbelievable. Harry, this Monster Slayer, will he fight the Strigoi for us?" I began to calm down. Yes, he'll fight the Strigoi. Well, he said he would. All we can do is wait and see." "Then that is good, is it not? That was a successful mission?" "Yes, that was a successful mission. Well, I hope it was. We certainly did our best." Jenica picked up her father's diary. "I have learned very much, too, while you were gone." "Oh, yeah?" "Harry, Listen to me. I have learned things that before now I never understood. For instance, why my father was always so obsessed with hunting down the Strigoi. I could really use a drink, Jenica. I also learned very important information about myself. I poured myself a glass of palinka, and I was about to knock it back when I realized that Jenica was trying to tell me something very serious. I stared at her. You're upset, aren't you? It has been a shock. I never knew any of this before. Tell me. In his diary, my father says that he met my mother in 1969 when he was a student in university in Romania, and she was working in the cafe where he used to study. He says they fell in love deeply and wanted to get married, but her father, Nikolai, threw a big rage when they told him about their relationship and forbade them to see each other any more. After many arguments, my father took my mother to the United States with him, and they were married here in New York without her father's knowledge. Okay, I nodded. My father and my mother were very happy, and they could never understand why my grandfather had been so angry that they should not marry. But 3 years later, when my mother was expecting me, my father took her back to Romania so that they should have a reconciliation with my grandfather. My father is very honorable, and he believed that no man should be estranged from his daughter or his grandchild. Okay, I'm with you so far, I said. I swallowed palinka and let out a bark like a sheepdog. What makes me think that this happy family reunion didn't turn out so happy? Because now that my mother was pregnant, my grandfather was forced to tell my father and my mother why he had opposed so fiercely their relationship. He said that when she was pregnant, my grandmother, Ekaterina, had traveled to Horizu in the mountains to visit her cousins. On the way, the bus broke down, and when night was falling, the driver and the 7 passengers had been stranded in the forest near Kakiolata. In the morning, the driver and 6 of the passengers were found murdered, with their throats cut, but my grandmother had survived, although she had been raped many times. Only a few days later, my grandmother developed a burning fever, just like Frank. She gave birth to my mother prematurely, and then she died. She had been infected by the Strigoi, and she had become one of the Pale People. My grandfather named my mother Mariana, which means bitter grace. Jenica handed me her father's diary with its floppy leather cover. She pointed to a paragraph at the bottom of the page and said, "Read." Razvan Dragomir's writing was very neat and intense, the writing of a man who has a terrible thing to tell but wants it to be clearly understood. Nikolai told me that after Ekaterina had died, one of the oldest and most venerable of the gynecologists at the Petiste Clinic took him into a private room. The gynecologist said that he would explain to Nikolai what had happened to Ekaterina and what might happen to Mariana as she grew up, but he must never breathe a word to anybody for fear of attracting the attention of the undead. Given certain conditions, baby Mariana's health should not be adversely affected by the sickness that had claimed her mother's life. However, her bloodstream would always carry the Strigoica strain, which could never be eliminated, even by complete transfusion. This strain would be passed down through the female side of the family forever. Unlike a full-blooded Strigoica, Mariana would not be unduly sensitive to sunlight, and she would not have the same insatiable thirst for human blood. But she would have many of the characteristics of the Pale People, such as the ability to contort her body into seemingly impossible positions and to climb seemingly impossible obstacles. Furthermore, the gynecologist said that she would also be able to pass through the silver doors whenever she wished, although he did not clearly explain to Mariana's father what he meant by this. I lowered the diary. Silver doors, I said. Could that mean mirrors? Don't tell me your mother could walk through mirrors. But Jenica said, carry on, there's more. The gynecologist clearly explained to Nikolai that if Mariana were to bear any girl child, that girl child would similarly be infected with the Strigoi strain. Boy children would not be affected, and neither would any man with whom she had sexual congress, except if she performed the ritual of Samodiva before she did so. The ritual of Samodiva would make the man's blood vulnerable to the Strigoi strain, and he would almost certainly become infected too. I put the book down again. So what your dad's saying in his diary, your grandmother passed the Strigoi strain onto your mother, and your mother passed the strain onto you. And if you ever have a daughter, she's going to be the same. My God, Jenica, you're half a vampire, and he never told you? Jenica's eyes were glistening with tears. He has always tried to keep me away from boys, all my life. Don't tell me you've never... No, of course not. How could he stop me? But he has always turned very cold and hostile if he thinks that I am serious about any particular boyfriend, and he never allows me to bring any of them back to this apartment. He always says that the only man a girl really needs is her father. I always used to think that he was being overpossessive, but all he wanted to do was stop me from having children. Girl children, anyhow. This gets madder by the minute. Did you ever guess your mother could walk through mirrors? Did you think that she ever guessed that she could walk through mirrors? I don't think so. From what my father wrote in his diary, I believe that he did not really understand what silver doors were, any more than my grandfather Nikolai did. After all, there is very little in any of the legends to say that Strigoi can hide inside mirrors, is there? So even with all of his research, he may not have discovered what this meant. I was finding it almost impossible to get my head around all of this, but I could understand why Jenica was so distressed. It was bad enough finding out that you were blood related to the undead, without discovering that your father had known about it for years and kept it quiet. I poured myself another glass of palinka, right to the brim, and I filled up Jenica's glass too. Jenica said, "Look!" She held up her left hand and bent her thumb right back until it was touching her wrist. I could always do things like this. I used to think that it was ordinary. It was grotesque, but it was fascinating, too. Pity we don't have any mirrors left, I said. You could try walking through the silver doors, too. Oh, I don't think I would wish to try that. Who knows what kind of world there is on the other side of the mirror? Who knows if I could ever find my way back? And if that is where the Strigoi are all hiding during the day, what a frightening place it must be. Still, it would be interesting to see if you could just maybe poke your pinky into a mirror. Jenica was silent for a while. Then she wiped her eyes with her fingers and said, "Are you hungry? You must be hungry. I have some canned pasta, I think." Jenica made us a meal of cold Chef Boyardee spaghetti bolognese and saltine crackers. We sat in the living room in the gathering gloom, and I told her all about Changing Woman and Amelia's seance. I didn't want to ask her any more about her father's diaries. She obviously needed time to think them over. "So, how do you plan to find this Miss Quamakas?" she asked me. I'm hoping that Monster Slayer is going to track down Vasily Loop and burn him up. If he does that, Misquamacus won't have a spirit to hide in anymore. All the same, he sounds tenacious, this Misquamacus, to revive himself even when his spirit was scattered. He's not going to rest until he gets his revenge. That's why. You should take a rest. You look exhausted. I stood up and took Jenica's plate for her. I will, when this is over. Maybe you and I could take a vacation together. You could show me Romania. Romania? I never want to go back to Romania. Without the superstition of Romania, this would never have happened. There are fools and peasants in Romania. How do you think they tolerated Ceausescu for so long? Don't ask me. We re-elected Bill Clinton. The sun set, messy and yellow, like a fried egg with the yolk broken. But still Gil wasn't back. I stood by the open window, keeping a lookout and trying to make the best of a slack, sultry breeze. By 10:45 p.m., it was almost ridiculously dark, with 2 hours to go before moonrise, so I was peering out at total blackness. Now and then I thought I glimpsed a hunched-up shape scurrying from one side of the street to the other. Could have been the Pale people, could have been Strigoi, could have been my eyes playing tricks on me. I heard screaming again, over towards James Walker Park, and then again to the south, toward Clarkson Street, and about 20 minutes later I saw 6 or 7 small fires burning. I was sure that I could feel hysteria in the air, although it may have been nothing but my own exhaustion. I was hoping that the monster slayers were out there tonight, running down the Strigoi, but as the hours went by I became less and less convinced that they would really come to save us. Did Native American spirits always keep their promises? They probably did, but did they keep their promises to white men? I was about to close the window when I heard shouting in the street below, and footsteps. I leaned out, but at first I couldn't see anybody. Then I saw a flashlight dancing from side to side, as if it was being held by somebody who was running. "Harry! Open the door! Harry! The bastards are after me!" "Hold on!" I shouted back. I vaulted over the couch, into the hallway, and out of the apartment door. Jenica said, "Harry! What is it? Harry!" Gil was already beating on the front door and screaming out, "Harry, for God's sake, open the door!" I took the stairs, gripping the handrails and vaulting down them 7 at a time. When I reached the second landing, I staggered and twisted my ankle, but I managed to do a complicated pirouette and regain my balance. I threw myself down the next flight, hobbled along the hallway, and wrenched open the front door. Gil threw himself at me, and we both went sprawling backward onto the floor. I jarred my shoulder blade, and there was blood everywhere, all over my hands, all over my face, all over my shirt. I looked over Gil's shoulder, and there stood 3 pale-faced men, caught in the upward beam from Gil's flashlight. One of them was wearing a heavily blood-stained sweatshirt, as if he had been working in an abattoir. The second was half naked and flabby-bellied and covered in huge blue welts, and the third was dressed in a tattered suit, like a down-and-out mortician. I saw knives glinting, and I heard that thick, thirsty ruff, ruff, ruff. "Gil!" I yelled at him. "Gil, for God's sake, get off me!" Gil opened his eyes and stared at me. He coughed right in my face, and then he managed to heave himself up onto one knee. I wriggled out from under him, twisted myself to one side, and kicked out at the first of the Strigoi as he tried to step into the hallway. Gil climbed to his feet and pulled me up, too, even though his hands were slippery with blood. We turned to face the Strigoi, but this time I seriously thought we were finished. They advanced on us, holding their knives high. The mortician had a very long boning knife that was rusty-colored with dried blood. The Strigoi in the sweatshirt blinked into the hallway right next to us. Gil kicked at him, then karate chopped him on the side of the neck, but the Strigoi leaned backward at an impossible angle so that Gil missed him, and then he swung back upright again and started stabbing at Gil so frenziedly that his knife looked like a blur of 20 different knives. Gil's hands and forearms were smothered in blood, and I could see a gaping slice in the muscle of his right shoulder. "Damn blood-drinking bastards!" Gil was gasping. The mortician ducked his head down, and the next thing I knew, he was right behind me, trying to hook his arm around me so that he could cut my throat. I grabbed hold of his wrist and hit it hard against the banister, and then the hall table, and then the banister again, and then I threw myself backward against him with all of my weight. I felt his ribs crunch between me and the wall. I was about to turn around and give him the old Three Stooges poke in the eyes with my stiffened fingers, but suddenly he wasn't there anymore. He had blinked back onto the porch, and he was almost running at me with his knife held up high. Gil was wrestling with both of the other two Strigoi and roaring, "Ah!" so loud that I could hardly hear anything else. The mortician swished his knife one way and then swished it the other. There was nothing in his eyes at all. No rage, no hatred, no madness, nothing. But I knew that he wouldn't back off, and that he was determined to kill me and slit my throat and drink the blood as it pumped straight out of my neck. And then he exploded. Right in front of me, only inches away, he exploded. There was only the softest of woofs, and then his insides seemed to detonate. His head flew off sideways, and his body burst into the fiercest of flames, and in only a few seconds he had dropped onto the floor, and he was blazing like a KKK crucifix. The other two Strigoi looked around, their faces questioning, but they didn't stay alive long enough to find out the answer. They, too, exploded, and for a few seconds the hallway was filled with burning bits of them. Hands, feet, pelvic girdles, lungs, and loops of rapidly shriveling intestine. Panting, bleeding, Gil and I looked out of the front door in thankful bewilderment. Out in the street, utterly silent, stood 6 or 7 very dark shapes. They were only visible because of the flaming Strigoi whose dismembered body parts littered our front doorstep. I thought that I could make out horns and necklaces, and for a split second I thought that I saw 2 eyes open, as narrow as the slits in a steel worker's mask, and a molten white light too bright to be looked at. "Monster slayers," I said, and I couldn't hide how awestruck I was. "The people with sun behind their eyes." Gil said, "First time the Indians have come riding to the rescue." Then he sneezed and sprayed me with blood. "Hold on," I said. I kicked all the blazing body parts onto the sidewalk. The intestines were the worst because they stuck to my shoes and got themselves tangled around my ankles, and all the time I was trying to get them loose, they were making a loud frying noise. Soon, however, all that remained was the mortician's fiery skull, which was lying on the doormat, burning the bristles. I hooked my left foot around it and booted it down the steps, and it bounced all the way across the street, still blazing, until it hit the curb on the opposite side. By the time I closed the front door, the horn-headed figures of the monster slayers were long gone. Hunting for more Strigoi, I hoped. This was their land, after all, the grandsons and granddaughters of Changing Woman, and because it was theirs, they could draw on all of its richness and all of its spiritual power. Judging by what had happened on this doorstep, the Strigoi needed to find themselves some pretty dark places to hide. Gil's hands and arms were crisscrossed with cuts, and his shoulder was bleeding badly, but otherwise he didn't seem to be too seriously injured. I helped him up from the floor, and for a moment we stood looking at ourselves in the hallway mirror. We looked like two walking wounded from a full-scale war. "Forgot to break that one," said Gil, nodding at the mirror. "Don't want them getting into the building through there." "Let me get you upstairs, then I'll come back down here and do the honors." It was a struggle climbing the stairs. Gil had to stop every now and then and catch his breath. "You should have come back before nightfall," I said. He leaned back against the paneled staircase. "I know, but to tell you the truth, I have a confession to make. I tried to get my wife and daughters over to Jersey." "What?" "I went back home and they were terrified. The Strigoi had tried to break into our apartment 3 or 4 times, so I got them to pack a bag and we went to the Holland Tunnel. I thought maybe, because I was military, they would let me through, but there was no way. They have barricades, they have razor wire, they have orders to shoot you on sight if you try to get through. So I had no choice. I had to bring them back home and barricade them in again." "You could have stayed with them, Gil. You should have stayed with them. I would have understood." Gil wiped blood across his upper lip. "I'm a soldier, Harry. I know the meaning of duty." "Well, I appreciate your coming back. At least we know that the monster slayers are out and about and doing what they promised. Did you see that old guy blow up right in front of me? That was something, wasn't it?" "Harry?" called Jenica, her voice echoing down the stairwell. "Are you okay down there?" "Battered, but unbowed," I called back. I wrapped Gil's arm around my shoulders and heaved him up the last 2 flights of stairs to the Dragomir's apartment. Jenica was waiting for us, and she immediately helped Gil through to the living room, and together we lowered him onto the couch. Almost at once I could see that he was much more badly hurt than I had thought. The front of his t-shirt was wet with blood, and when Jenica dragged it off him, we could see that it wasn't just from the cuts on his arms. He had a puncture wound just below his rib cage, and it was bubbling. "I will bring antiseptic and bandage," said Jenica. "Meantime, Harry, press this tissue against this hole to stop more blood." "It's nothing," said Gil, peering down at it. "Minor stab wound, that's all. I had shrapnel in my leg in Bosnia, 37 stitches. "How about a drink?" I asked him. "Nothing like palinka to ease any kind of pain, physical or spiritual." "Why not? I'll tell you something, Harry. When this is all over, I'm going to open a palinka bar on 7th Avenue, and I'm going to call it Amnesia." Jenica brought in a plastic basin filled with water from the bathtub. She sponged Gil's stomach and his shoulder and dressed his wounds with Band-Aids and clean, folded handkerchiefs. Then we helped him to limp through to the bedroom and eased him down on the bed. "What you need is sleep," said Jenica, and she leaned over and kissed him on the forehead. "Frank died in this bed," Gil protested. "Well, he did and he didn't. Frank isn't exactly dead yet." "Thanks for the comforting reminder." Jenica and I went back to the living room. I could have done with some sleep myself, but I knew that I wouldn't be able to close my eyes. Besides, I had to go down to the hallway and break that mirror. I doubted if the Strigoi would try to come back here after the monster slayers had been around, but I decided that it was better to be overcautious than lose my entire blood supply to some dead-eyed wacko with a box cutter. Jenica picked up the decorated bone that we had found in Vasily Loop's casket. "You know, I've been wondering all day about this, where it came from, why it seems to have such power." "I've seen something like it before," I said. 2 of them, as a matter of fact. They were bones from a wonder worker's legs. which you could tap together as if he was running, and you could follow him into the spirit world. They used to belong to White Bull, who was the medicine man for Crazy Horse. Did they work? I didn't really want to talk about it because it had been a bad experience, but I nodded. Yes, they did, but not in the same way as this. I reached across and took the bone away from her and lifted it up. White Bull's bones had to be used as part of a sacred ritual, but this has some kind of internal energy all of its own, doesn't it? I ask myself, why was it lying in the vampire gatherer's casket? Who knows? Maybe there was no special reason. After Miss Quimacus had roused up the vampire gatherer, maybe he just didn't need it anymore, and so he left it behind. An artifact as so powerful as this? I don't think so. I think your wonder worker left it lying in the vampire gatherer's casket for some purpose. And remember that when you shook it at him, he walked away, very quick, as if it possessed a magic that he could not defy. I examined the bone more closely. There were tiny figures carved all along it, all intertwined. The interesting thing was, unlike the figures you usually saw in Native American carving, they were all fully dressed, like white men. Jenica said, "What I ask myself is, how did Miss Quimacus obtain this bone? So, yes, we know from your spirit guide, Seeking Rock, that the very hot fire of 9/11 forged back together again the separated parts of his Manitou, so that his spirit was again whole. But his spirit still had no substance, did it? What the 19th century mediums used to call ectoplasm. So with no substance, how did he find the bone? And how did he carry it to Vasily Loop's casket so that he could revive him? It is eggs and chickens." You're asking me for answers I don't even know the questions to. Jenica's eyes were shining in the candlelight. Something is missing in this equation. I sense that somebody else is behind the scenes of what is happening here. Chapter 21, Bloodstream. On the side table, among the jewel boxes of the decorative paperweights, I found a small bronze ornament of a grinning Romanian gnome. He was only a little guy, but very heavy, with a pointed hat, and he was perfect for breaking a mirror. Hefting him up in the palm of my hand, I hobbled downstairs as quickly as I could. There was a stomach-turning stench of scorched carpet and burned intestines still hanging around the stairwell, like the rottenest barbecue you ever smelled in your life, and I couldn't stop my mouth from filling up with undigested spaghetti bolognese before I swallowed it again. When I reached the hallway, I gripped the gnome firmly by the base and approached myself in the mirror. I pulled a suitably determined face and lifted up the gnome, but I was just about to smash the mirror to pieces when I saw something reflected in it. A postcard lying on the hall table. A postcard that certainly wasn't there before when we were fighting the Strigoi. I turned around and picked it up. The picture on the front showed a large white house under a deep blue sky with crimson maple trees in front of it and a small circular lake. The Kensico Country Inn, Valhalla, New York. I turned it over. There was no stamp on it and no address, but someone had scrawled Heref. I frowned at it. Herf? Maybe somebody was trying to write Hereford, but was interrupted halfway through. I looked around. The question was, who had put it here? The front door was firmly locked and bolted. I had done it myself. And so far as we knew, there was nobody else in the building. All of the other residents were either on vacation, or else they had gone out for one reason or another and hadn't returned. Caught by the pale people, probably, or sucked dry by Strigoi. I went across and tried the door of the first-floor apartment. It was locked. Then I went to the end of the hallway and tried the door that must have led out to the backyard. That was locked, too, and bolted from the inside. There was only one other way in that I could think of: the mirror. I slowly approached the mirror until my forehead was pressed against it and stared right into it. All I could see was me. Only the Strigoi could have come through this mirror, but if they had, why hadn't they tried to attack us, and why had they left this postcard? Then it occurred to me, Frank. The postcard had been left here by Frank. Hadn't he promised me that whatever happened, he would never forget his oath to protect human life? The scrawl said, here, and then F. Frank had come here to tell me where Miss Quimacus was hiding. I was still staring at the mirror, trying to decide if I ought to break it or not, when I heard a piercing scream from upstairs, and a door slamming, and the sound of chairs crashing to the floor. "Harry!" shouted Jenica. "Harry, come quick!" I might have hobbled down the stairs, but I ran back up them like a mountain goat. The door to the Dragomir's apartment was wide open, and Jenica was standing outside on the landing, panting with fear, holding up the bone to protect herself. Inside, halfway along the corridor, stood a thin, wild-eyed man in a loose-fitting caftan, which was heavily soaked in blood. He had shoulder-length hair, which was dripping wet, and a scraggly, unkempt beard. He was carrying a machete, which was dripping blood onto the floor. "I think he's killed Gil," said Jenica. "Where the hell did he come from? You didn't open any windows, did you?" "Of course not. Are you crazy? I don't know where he came from. I went to see if Gil was all right, and he was standing over his bed, and there was so much blood. Gil, I think he's cut his head off." The wild-eyed man stared at us, but he came no closer. For some reason he looked edgy and undecided, as if he couldn't work out what to do next. He was making that coarse, greedy sound under his breath, but it almost seemed as if he was afraid to attack us. "It's the bone," I said to Jenica. "He's afraid of the bone." "What?" "Give it to me. Let me try something." Jenica handed me the bone. I lifted it up in my right hand and shook it, and chanted the only Native American language I knew. "Hua, wikasechikala, he kus nisnio, lo wachin." At first, the wild-eyed man stayed right where he was. I took a step toward him and repeated my chant. I waved the bone from side to side, and then I prodded it toward him. "Wakatanka, Intanka Nitawa," I shouted. The wild-eyed man raised his machete. My heart was thumping, but I took another step toward him, waving the bone, and then another. He stared at me and slowly drew his lips back in a horrible parody of a smile. I thought for one moment that he knew what I was chanting, and that he was laughing at me. But then he turned around and rushed toward the bathroom, his caftan catching on the door handle. I rushed after him, but he had managed to tear his caftan free, and before I could grab him, he had run across the bathroom and dived head first into the tub full of water. He disappeared below the surface, and he was gone. Not a single splash. He hadn't even caused a ripple. Holding the bone high in front of me, I walked right up to the edge of the bathtub. There was nothing in it but water. Only a thin swirl of blood betrayed the fact that one of the Strigoi had used it as a means of escape. I was still standing there when Jenica came in. She looked around and then she said, "Where is he? Where did he go?" "Same place he came from, I'll bet." "What do you mean?" "We've just learned something new about the Strigoi. Not only can they hide inside mirrors, they can hide inside water, too. It's obvious when you think about it. All they need is a perfect reflection." "Empty the tub," said Jenica. "If we do that, what are we going to drink?" "I don't know. I don't care. There is still plenty of wine and beer." "Okay," I said, and pulled out the plug. Jenica came up close to me, and together we watched the water gurgling down the waste pipe. "Gil is dead," she said. "If only I had known that the Strigoi can walk through water." We went through to the bedroom. Gil was lying on his side with his head thrown back, so that he was staring blindly at the headboard. His neck had been cut through to the spine, and the sheets were dark with blood. It reminded me horribly of those terrorist videos where hostages have their heads cut off. I picked up the pale blue bed cover from the floor and dragged it over the bed to cover him. Shit, he was such a great guy. He didn't deserve to die like this. "You must not feel guilty, Harry. He was a soldier. He knew how dangerous this might be." I looked down at the bed cover, which already had blood creeping across it. "I'll have to find his wife and daughters somehow and tell them that they won't be seeing him again." "We will do that together." I followed Jenica out of the bedroom and closed the door behind me and locked it. I was sure that Gil was properly dead, unlike Frank, but you know, why take chances? If wild-eyed men with machetes could rise out of the bathwater, who knows what was possible? We went into the living room. The palinka was all finished, so, without being asked, I took a bottle of Death Breath red wine and started to open it. "So we must revenge him," said Jenica. "It seems as if revenge is the only language that your Miss Quamacus understands. If only we could know where he is." "I don't know what good it's going to do us, but I believe that we might." I stopped twisting the corkscrew and took the postcard out of my pocket. "The Kensico Country Inn? Where did you get this?" "I found it downstairs. I think that Frank brought it. See, it says here, and then it's signed with an F." "And this is all?" "It must have been Frank. Nobody could have gotten into the house except through the hallway mirror. And who else do we know who's a vampire? Well, present company excepted." Jenica waited while I opened the wine and poured us each a large glass. It smelled so strong that you could almost get intoxicated just by breathing it in. She took a sip, and then she said, "You didn't yet break the mirror downstairs?" "Not yet, no. If Frank is using it to bring us inside information, I thought it might be better if I left it intact. We can always lock the doors, can't we? And our trusty bone seems to frighten off Strigoi." "What did you say to him? Was that Native American language?" "Lakota Sioux," I said. "Hello, little man. Don't do that. I'm hungry." Jenica's eyes widened. "Is that all?" "Well, a couple of words from the Gospel according to St. Luke." She smiled. "Perhaps the way to fight madness is with more madness." "Hey, we called in the monster slayers, didn't we? It isn't easy to get much madder than that." "But this will not be finished until we have destroyed Vasily Lup, or sealed him back in his casket, and your Miss Quamacus who hides inside him." "Well, with any luck, the monster slayers will track him down." "Maybe they will, but remember that Vasily Lup is Savarkalaki, a dead vampire, and he leaves no scent that any creature can follow, man or beast or monster slayer. And from what you have told me of your Misquamacus, do you think he will allow the monster slayers to disperse his Manitou back to the elements? He is a Native American wonder worker, and the monster slayers are Native American spirits. Well, I don't know what else we can do. Listen to me, Harry. Even if the monster slayers can find and kill every Strigoi but one, it is impossible to stop them from spreading. So long as the spirits of Vasily Loop is still living and the Manitou of Misquamacus is living inside him, the Strigoi will multiply all across America, and you can believe me that darkness will fall in every city and every community from New York to San Francisco. Yes, very dramatically put, but Misquamacus isn't going to make it easy for us, I can tell you. And for starters, we can't even get out of Manhattan. Gil tried, and with his wife and his daughters, but the military wouldn't let him through, and he's a soldier. I paused, and then I added, was a soldier, poor bastard. Jenica held up the postcard. So how do you think that Vasily Loop managed to avoid the roadblocks? How did he manage to get out of Manhattan and all the way up to Valhalla? That is way up past White Plains, isn't it? He went through the mirror, didn't he? He used the good old silver door. Yes? What do you mean, yes? I have Strigoi in my blood, Harry. I can use the good old silver door, too. You don't mean... I can go after Vasily Loop. I can follow him to Valhalla, and I can send him back to his casket and seal him there. I have the disenchantment, after all. What about Misquamacus? He's not going to allow you to do that, just like he didn't allow you to do it right here in this apartment. I have the bone, yes? That will protect me. Once I have disenchanted Vasily Loop, Misquamacus will have no spirit to hide in. I will think of some way. You're out of your mind. You said yourself that the mirror world is far too dangerous. For God's sake, Jenica, once you go through that mirror, even supposing you can, it's going to be wall-to-wall vampires in there. You won't last 2 minutes. And if you think you can beat Misquamacus on your own and without any kind of a plan, forget it. He'll have your soul trapped forever inside some flea-ridden prairie dog before you can say, "Gitchi Manitou." I will take the risk. What else can I do? I am the only person in the city who has both the knowledge to send the vampire gatherer back to his casket and the ability to find him. She paused for a moment. Her face was shiny with perspiration, and her black hair was stuck to her forehead. Gil died for us. Gil died for a purpose. I am prepared to do the same if it is necessary. I swallowed wine, and for a moment I thought I was going to experience the regurgitation of the spaghetti bolognese. It's a very noble idea, I said, but like most very noble ideas, it's incredibly dumb. Supposing you disappear into the mirror, and that's the last I see of you. How am I going to know if you managed to send Vasily Loop back to his box? How am I going to know if you destroyed Misquamacus? Your spirit guide will tell you. No, this is not going to work. It's suicide. Then what are we going to do? Stay in this apartment until we die of dehydration? Outside in the street there was hideous screaming, the screaming of somebody who was suffering unimaginable agony. Jenica and I went to the window and looked down. The moon had risen now, and we could see at least a dozen black figures strung right across the street from one sidewalk to the other. They were monster slayers, creatures of smoke and darkness, their outlines glittering with broken glass and other debris that they had attracted from the surface of the street. I could see their horns and their necklaces and their strange stilted legs, which gave them the appearance of heavy-headed buffalo. Facing them were 3 strigoi, 2 men, one of them completely naked, and a half-naked woman. A 4th strigoi was lying in pieces on the asphalt, with thick smoke pouring out of him and a few small flames still licking his head. As we watched, 2 of the monster slayers stepped forward. The strigoi turned to run away, but 2 rays of searing white light leaped out of the monster slayer's eyes and hit the naked man directly in the middle of his back. For a fraction of a second, I could see his insides burning so that his rib cage glowed luminous scarlet like a lamp. Then he blew apart, and his arms and his legs went flying, and all of his intestines and his internal organs were strewn across the street, blazing ferociously. The other 2 strigoi had reached a house on the opposite side of the street. They started to climb the front wall as swiftly as squirrels, but the monster slayers were too quick for them. They were only halfway up the 2nd story when 3 monster slayers lifted their heads and opened their eyes, and 6 blinding rays of light hit them in the head and the back. I heard the woman scream before she exploded, and it sounded like somebody who had just had her first experience of hell. Fiery pieces of strigoi fell into the basement in front of the house. The woman's head rolled under a parked car, and it was still burning when the monster slayers had walked down to the end of Leroy Street and turned right onto Hudson. I knew that they were on our side, but all the same I found them very scary, especially that bison-like way they walked. "There," I said to Jenica, "we're winning." "You know that we can never win until the vampire gatherer is gone, and your Miss Quamacus with him." "I wish you'd stop calling him my Miss Quamacus. That mook has caused me nothing but misery ever since I first heard his name." I turned away from the window, but then Jenica said, "He is your Miss Quamacus, Harry. I know how to disenchant Vasily Loop. I believe that you can think of a way to destroy Miss Quamacus. You remember that ritual my father mentioned?" "Ritual?" "In his diary, he said that the Strigoica strain could be passed from a woman to a man if he underwent the ritual of Samodiva. That would make his blood susceptible to her infection." "I don't understand what you're trying to suggest here. Actually, I think I do, but I'm not at all sure that I like it." "But you do not want me to go into the mirror to face Vasily Loop alone, do you? So what better answer than if you come with me?" "Now I know you've lost it." Jenica came up to me and took hold of both of my hands tightly. I just adored the beads of perspiration on her upper lip. "Harry, nobody else can disenchant Vasily Loop but me, and I cannot do it without you. So what choice do we have?" I thought dying of dehydration sounded quite attractive by comparison. "I am sure that my father has the words of the ritual of Samodiva in one of his books." "Okay, but who exactly is Samodiva? Sounds like an Irish opera singer to me." "Samodiva is different in different mythology. In Bulgaria, she is a wood fairy. In Romania, it is neither a he or a she, but the recorder of death. It lives deep in the forests, and its face is always hidden in darkness. In Samodiva's book, the names of the living are written in red ink, and the names of the dead are written in black." "So you perform the ritual of Samodiva, and my blood is then open to your infection? I can become half a vampire, too? And I can step through the silver door, just like you?" Jenica nodded. "It means yes. you can come with me." "Well, that's exactly what I'm getting at. In order for me to become infected with the Strigwoika strain, we have to, become intimate." "Yes, and that isn't a problem as far as you're concerned?" "Why should it be?" "I don't know. No special reason. If it's okay with you, then it's absolutely fine by me." She reached up and gently took hold of my earlobe and rubbed it between finger and thumb. It was the most arousing thing that a woman had ever done for me. "Harry," she said, "we have no choice, do we? Our destiny says that we must." Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you'll join us next Saturday morning for another installment, and actually the final installment of Manitou Blood. So until then, have a great week, everyone.